Hello and welcome to this video. We are going to meet Eric Joseph, one of my viewers, who's kindly posted the unseen poetry essay for us. So how do you think the speaker feels about the child and his experience of learning to read, and how does the poet present the speaker's feelings? And this is based on a poem, Slow Reader by Vicki Feaver, which I deliberately haven't read because what I want to show you is how your skills as a writer will work with this question without knowing the poem at all. You can read this poem for yourself by visiting the Poetry Archive and putting in Vicki Feaver Slow Reader, and I'll put a link to that in the description down here at the bottom. I suggest you read the poem after you've read the essay in the video. In this essay, I'll be talking about how the poet uses language, structure and form to present the speaker's feelings about the child. On a literal understanding, we can see that the speaker feels sad and disappointed for the young boy who is slow to read. Well, this is a really clear introduction, although it doesn't have a quotation in it, so for me it's not scoring marks yet. It's very useful because Eric is reminding himself that he needs to write about language, structure and form. This is a bit tricky in this question. You must obviously quote to write about language, and you must write about the structure of the poem. Writing about the form of the poem, it's an unseen one, is really difficult because you won't really have a name for it. If it's not a sonnet or a ballad, or if it's just in free verse, it's going to be really hard for you to write about form. I don't really know how the examiners are going to play this. So that's why I'm going to end up giving this a grade 8 instead of a 9, because there isn't really a discussion of form. There is a brilliant discussion of structure, as you'll see. In the beginning, which are the first 5 lines, the poet gives us an understanding that the speaker is quite proud of her son. This is shown in lines 1 to 4, but is a sharp contrast to line 5, where she writes that her son is slow to read. The use of the long vowels in the verbs slow and read slows down the pace of the poem and is similar to the slowness at which the young boy reads. So this is a structural point. It's a really clever one, actually. Slow to read actually is slow to read, isn't it? And so it's a very valid point. It's not one of those where in the exam you're just coming up with anything to kind of fit the structure. It actually works with the poem. It would be even better if we had the actual contrast, so something quoted to show how proud she is of the son originally. But this focusing on contrast is something that skilled students do. And the more you focus on how writers use contrasts, the better your interpretations will be. The poet uses similes to give the idea of the boy's lack of hope because of his slow reading skills. She writes that while he reads, he sighs and shakes his head like an old man who knows the mountains are impassable. So far you should realise that Eric is following my suggested method for writing about poetry. Focusing first on the beginning and then on some OAP's aims or SOAP's aims, whatever you want to call them, language features anyway, and there's the simile, the language feature that he's focusing on. Well, hopefully you're expecting to see another language feature, because there are 2 in Booz or Bootsy, depending on which of my methods you're using. So we're expecting another language feature next. Okay, so Eric's a bit of a star here because he's going to focus on the noun in that simile, but also then give us a new simile down here, cold as grizzly meat. But these 2 language features, the 2 similes, will be linked together. So let's read it. The use of the noun mountains describes the barrier which he faces and the extent of its size. So 2 clear explanations there. And the adjective impassable implies that the boy knows no matter how hard he tries, he'll never read fast. So that's a brilliant description with embedded quotations that work perfectly, great analysis. And now this is a further explanation of the simile, which leads this analysis to be evaluative. The simile also describes his character as being unfriendly and unsympathetic towards his mother. She writes that his words are cold as grizzly meat. The use of the adjective, gristly meat, gristly, which has connotations of toughness and hardness, gives an idea of how his character has developed from early on in the poem, from a joking and almost mature nature to a cold, unfriendly boy. So that's a brilliant analysis, brilliant evaluation, because it shows how the character has changed through the poem. You can see, hopefully, that quotation from earlier in the poem that I said would be really useful would be doubly useful here, because it would form that contrast that we're looking for. But under exam conditions, you would be forgiven for that, because your other quotations fit your argument so perfectly. Okay, next, Eric focuses on the title part of Bootsy. And what I found when I got the answers back from my own students was that they didn't actually need to write about the title to get the full marks. However, putting it in, if you have time, will definitely show a real evaluative skill. So the title also possibly shows us the relationship between the mother and the son. The elongated vowel sounds in slow reader starts the poem off very slowly. This may be interpreted as how their relationship is a slow, developing mother-son bond, as the mother tries to help her son through the difficulty of reading slowly. And you can see that links reasonably well with the paragraph that's gone before about how he has changed. So next in Bootsy comes the S for structure, and Eric has done what I do really, which is link structure and form together, and hope the examiner will treat it as one, rather than technically thinking about what kind of poem it is. Is it a sonnet? Is it a monologue or whatever? It's really difficult to describe the form of this poem, but I'm going to review that with the exam board and see if I'm right. So here we go. The structure and form of the poem can also be used to show the relationship and how it's structured. That's a really clever link. Most of the poem has enjambment or a comma at the end, with a few end-stop lines and no caesura. The extensive use of the enjambment and the comma slows down the pace of the poem. It's also implying the slow development of the mother and son's connection, about how they're both slowly getting back together. So I probably wouldn't agree with that interpretation, but that doesn't matter. What matters here is that Eric has made a really valid point about the structure of the poem and relating that to his interpretation. That's why it scores so highly. The poet also uses a dash to show the sharp contrast. Notice how frequently he's coming back to this idea twice in just this short bit of writing. And writing about contrast definitely lifts your answer above 90% of other students who just won't be noticing it. So the sharp contrast between her son's talents and the quality of slow reading which he possesses, this is seen in line 4. This perhaps suggests the unwillingness of the mother to say that her son is slow to read. So it's difficult to spot the quotation here, but actually the quotation is the use of the dash, which then leads to this idea of the contrast between the son's talents and then the phrase slow to read. So Bootsy then demands you to write about the E, the ending, and that's exactly what Eric has done. At the ending, the poet uses a clause to describe her control over her son. She writes that he'll never run quite free again. This shows the overprotective nature of the mother, which is a contrast to the freedom she gave her son towards the beginning of the poem. Now, to make that perfect, you need to make clear that this overprotected nature of the mother is actually what the mother herself is noticing. So I'm going to change the wording there. So here it is. This shows her self-criticism at her overprotective nature. That should be as a mother. Rushing there, sorry. As a mother, which is a contrast to the freedom she gave her son towards the beginning of the poem. And again, you can see how that quotation at the beginning of the poem would have been so useful. But I'm only going to deduct 1 mark really for those missing things. I don't think that you'd be able to write about form sensibly in this poem, and I don't think the examiner would mind. And that 1 missing quotation isn't going to hold you back too far. Now, the grade tolerance, of course, on a question is quite high, so another examiner might give it full marks, no bother at all. Let's just remind ourselves of what B. So start with the B beginning and the writer's viewpoint there, as far as you can work it out. Then you look at 2 language features, and you'll have a mnemonic that's similar to SOAP aims, which I've reorganised as OAP's aims here. You'll know the language features. Analyse the title if you have time and link it to the writer's viewpoint. Then find structure and form. This is the one that's most often left out by students, and many teachers ask you to put that at the beginning so that you don't forget it. That does work. You can stick it at the beginning if you want. And then the ending, the changed viewpoint, and hopefully you can see how the mother's perspective, which is now critical of herself, has changed. So let's go back now and look at the structure points and see why this is such a high ranking essay. So I've highlighted those in green. Contrast is a structural feature, placing one thing against another so that you will notice a deliberate difference. Commenting on how a character has changed through the poem is also an issue of the poem's structure. Focusing on the sounds created by words, alliteration or assonance, or here the elongated vowel sounds, that's a structural point about how the words are deliberately structured this way. And then there are the more obvious structural features, the end-stop lines, the caesura, the enjambment, and any issues around punctuation. And again, we've got that idea of contrast again. So you can see how many references to structure are interwoven throughout this answer. And that's why I don't teach my students to put the structure at the beginning, because it's a bit mechanical. That's not wrong, but you'll see that this writer has written a much more sophisticated answer by weaving these points about structure throughout the essay. So there you have it. I hope you find that really helpful in getting full marks. If not, write me a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe, and good luck in your exams. Oh yes, don't forget, go and read the poem.